All right, so welcome. My name is Dirk Ahrens, and I'm the president at Virtual Systems, and with Jonathan Butts, who's the healthcare director at Veeam. And we are doing a webinar today on the evolving landscape of data management in healthcare. There's a ton of stuff that's changing in healthcare with the current state of the pandemic, evolving threats that are happening, some of them related to the pandemic, some of them not, new technologies that are evolving. And so we started talking with Veeam a number of months ago, Virtual Systems did, and just started having some conversation about, we should put out just some thought leadership on what's changing, how it's affecting healthcare. When we think about data management, you know, how are the state of things really affecting the healthcare industry? And so that's what you're jumping into today. So I'm gonna intro myself a minute, then Jonathan's gonna intro himself, and we're kind of, we'll give you kind of a survey on what we're going to be talking about in kind of a challenge and response format as we go through the webinar, and then we'll do it. So again, my name is Dirk, and I actually got my start in healthcare when I started my career. I grew up in the Midwest, moved out to California, got some graduate degrees, and then got into mental health for a number of years, and moved from there into technology, working for Verizon, managing some IoT teams there. And then over to the cloud service provider organization here at Virtual Systems in the Midwest. And so I've been here for about 5 years. So Jonathan.
Thanks, Dirk. So I'm Jonathan Butts, Healthcare Director at Veeam. I joined Veeam 2 years ago to develop and run the healthcare practice with a focus on providers in North America. And before joining Veeam, I was a part-time CTO for several hospitals in both the Philly area and on the West Coast. And before that, I was part of VMware's healthcare strategy team under Frank Neidham as a healthcare strategist and product manager.
Good deal, thanks. All right, well, just want to say appreciate you. So as an attendee here, you are likely on an IT team supporting healthcare, and that has been a bigger task over the last several months than it has over the last, preceding several years, but it always is a big task, and we support a lot of frontline people who do some important work. And so just want to say appreciate you and the work that you do as somebody in IT who supports healthcare. Also want to thank you if you saw this webinar and registered, because it's a fundraiser for the American Red Cross. Appreciate that as well. So we thought at Virtual Systems, we kind of started the year by, instead of doing, hey, let's give away free lunches to people who register or $25 Amazon gift cards, we said, let's see what we can do to affect some organizations out there. And so we've been doing a series of webinars that do that really support organizations through, every time you register, we make a donation. So appreciate you if you did that. So here's the agenda today. So we're going to be looking at, I kind of mentioned challenge and response format, but just technology trends and data challenges today. So we're in the middle of a pandemic. How does that affect healthcare and the way we manage data and the way we manage our workforce today? I mentioned also the evolving threat landscape. So related to the pandemic or not, there's some different threats going on. How do we address some of that in healthcare? We're hearing a lot about this year about 5G mobility. So if you're watching any kind of media, you're seeing T-Mobile and Verizon and AT&T advertise that. How's that changing healthcare as well? And so then Veeam has some, I think great ways that they address some of those things, but really, even as a cloud service provider, Virtual Systems, I think we can provide some insight into, how are some of those things changing and what's happening, and what are organizations doing as we have conversations with organizations across the country, and they kind of change the way that they manage their own data and protect their data. So I'll hand it back to Jonathan. We'll do a quick intro on both Veeam and Virtual Systems, and then we'll jump into the content.
Right, thanks, Dirk. So Veeam is the largest global producer of data protection software. We have more than 375,000 customers worldwide, and we're more than $1 billion in revenue annually. In healthcare, we have more than 20,000 provider customers globally, protecting more than 250,000 clinical applications worldwide. And one of the ways that we measure our contribution to the healthcare data center is with our Net Promoter Score, which is extraordinarily high. And one of the things that's interesting about our Net Promoter Score as a result of our most recent survey, it's 78 for our healthcare customers. It's actually higher than our Net Promoter Score overall, which is 75. And I really think that that speaks volumes to the value that we bring to the healthcare data center in reducing the total cost of data protection and providing software that's tremendously powerful and tremendously easy to use, that delivers a great deal of quality of life to the folks who use it.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on that and just say, if you don't know Net Promoter Score, it's one of those surveys that you get that just says, hey, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you love us? Or really, how much would you recommend us to somebody else? Because that's kind of the qualifying question. Only 9s and 10s count as what, NPS calls being a promoter. In previous jobs, I have seen targets for NPS, in the 40, 50 range. So to be at 78 is really exceptional. I think, and it's our experience with Veeam as a partner, and I know our clients have the same experience. Veeam just does a terrific job providing great support. So I think it's, cool that Veeam can boast about being the biggest, but I think it's better that they boast about that quality of service. So it's good stuff. So Virtual Systems, not as big as Veeam, but we really kind of started regionally in the Midwest. We actually started as an internet service provider, and then a cloud company kind of formed out of that. So we build our own infrastructure in data centers. We've got a 3 data center footprint, but we also leverage public cloud. And our goal really is just to provide excellent technology to our customers and also to provide that top shelf customer experience too. So it's typically VMware flavored cloud stuff, although we do some Hyper-V and other things, but we get VMware's best and brightest badge of being called cloud verified. So that is a badge that's reserved for their top 3% of partners globally. So, and even though we're not as big as Veeam, we are everywhere in North America. So we're in all 50 states and 10 Canadian provinces. So some of our affiliate partners at the bottom and some customers who love us down there too. So let's jump in to content. So the first topic we're going to tackle is really kind of this idea of threats and how those threats to data have continued to evolve, and especially in the wake of COVID. So I don't know if you're familiar at all with Verizon's data breach report, but if you're not, you should be. It's a really industry-leading document that talks every year about what are the breaches that are out there. What happened when big customers, when big companies lost data? How did it happen? They usually analyze between 3,000 and 5,000 breaches. So actually, let me go back. I'm going to try something here. I'm going to quick see if I can do a new share over to the document. If you haven't seen it, this is what it looks like. So you can just go to their website and download it. It's a PDF. And they summarize kind of what's happening with breaches. So you can see here they analyzed almost 4,000 breaches. And then they provide, kind of a summary. So some insights and summaries from that, some key takeaways. This is the executive summary report. You can get all the data from them. At the end, they do an SMB deep dive if that's where you're located in a business without less than 1,000 employees. That might be interesting to you. They break it into regional findings. But pertinent to our conversation today, you can see here, if you can follow my cursor, that they break it up by industry. And so you can go right into healthcare and see what are the patterns, what is the frequency, who's doing breaches in healthcare. And I think there's a lot to be gleaned from that. So I'm going to jump back over to the deck, and you'll see some stats that we pulled out from that. By far, 72% of breaches, by far, human error was the biggest problem when it came to leaked data, compromised data, stolen data. So you can see 72% were what Verizon called miscellaneous errors, but what they categorized it really as somebody made a mistake somewhere. And so the takeaway there was when you get into what they called control mechanisms, how do we solve the problem? 78% they said of breaches could have been at least somewhat less impactful with training to employees. So yeah, I think a big theme that came out of that really across verticals, but especially in healthcare, was we got to train our people. We got to let people know. We're going to see some stats later on in the deck, but there's a high percentage of breaches that just happen because somebody clicked something in an email. Veeam's got some great responses to that, some tools kind of built in, especially around Office 365, so we'll talk about that. But I think one of the takeaways for organizations is we got to be training employees. We got to be helping them understand at the entry point, you know, what they have to protect and what their responsibility is and how to vet the right emails and the wrong emails out. So here's a couple other stats. So motives are still primarily financial, even in healthcare. Data compromised is both medical and personal, but I mean, if you're thinking about the motive as being financial, you can kind of see the flavor is really, you know, a lot of data being held hostage or sold. So this is a case study, so this was kind of interesting. It came out, so in Microsoft, or in May, Microsoft detailed this one that came out. And if you think about Microsoft, usually not moving quite as fast, even on data breach reporting, but if you think about when COVID really started happening, this was in orchestration by, let's say, the bad actors really early in that as COVID started making its way across the news and across the world. But Microsoft Security Intelligence team put out a notice that, hey, there's a huge phishing attempt happening in healthcare, and victims got an email like we talked about. It looked like it was from Johns Hopkins. It said, you know, World Health Organization COVID-19 situation report. And then they opened it, they clicked on an Excel document. It had data in it, but it also had malware in it, and it stole data. So really, you know, that's what we're, you know, the stuff that we're up against is not necessarily that really blatantly obvious stuff. Quite often it's the stuff that looks relevant enough to be interesting and clickable. And honestly, our experience as a cloud service provider is that the bad actors are getting better and better at doing that. So, you know, I think the point here is not just that the threat is real, but that it keeps getting more advanced. Healthcare is the most targeted vertical, so that also came out of that Verizon's data breach incident report, but I've seen that information elsewhere too. Healthcare is a heavily targeted vertical because information is valuable, and candidly, healthcare organizations pay to get it back and protect it. And quite often, you know, ransomware targets backups. So I think we're seeing that more and more. Jonathan and I were talking yesterday about how common that is. So Jonathan, talk to us a little bit about, you know, kind of defenses that we see via Veeam, but also maybe some best practices that we're seeing kind of in the industry that you're hearing about with healthcare customers too.
Sure. So obviously, ransomware defense is a broad scope topic and requires a really comprehensive strategy that cuts across many disciplines. But at the last line of defense has always been data protection, because if you have your backup in a secure location, that's your last line against payment, if at least to have that option. So on the front end of things, obviously we need a very sophisticated detection system that uses heuristic-based scanning for both web-based traffic and email traffic to detect malware as it's entering the organization. And then we also need a suite of tools that are watching for unusual activity within the walls of the data center. And we have some of those pre-configured in our Veeam monitoring solution that look for unusual disk and network activity that can give us clues to ransomware activity in motion. And then when we talk about ultimately securing that back end, we look at creating functional air gaps that help us to separate the protected information from active systems. And, you know, historically, tape often filled that role, providing us both scale and a natural air gap because it was not accessible after it was taken off site or even just removed from the library. But we're seeing that's not viable in more and more circumstances as time goes on for both cost and administrative reasons. So there are some basic things that I still see not being universally employed in the provider space. Things as simple as making sure that your backup repositories are not on the domain and use separate credentials and don't share any local administrative account passwords with the rest of the environment. One of my customers suffered a breach late last summer that was, and their backups were identified as part of that. And had those backups been using separate credentials, it's much less likely that those would have been part of the system's compromised, and it would have given them another recovery option that they ended up not having. And then the other thing we can do at the network layer, looking to build more zero trust communication policies, leveraging either adaptive firewalls like VMware's NSX firewall feature set that of course scales very nicely across virtual infrastructure, and steps beyond. But Also even something as simple as leveraging firewall feature set in core switches to really limit what systems are even able to communicate with the backup repositories. One of the things that we've all noted as advisors to the provider space over the years is there's been a great emphasis on edge security, but much less on internal security, actually actively segmenting systems within and making sure that only things that need to talk to other things are actually able to do so. And then, of course, we have some things that use proprietary protocols. So a number of backup repositories that use that from vendors like HP. And of course, now we have the S3 object lock protocol that we can leverage both on premises and off. And then, of course, another classic piece of advice that has always been part of our recommendations is to have at least one copy of your data offsite.
Yeah, good call. I'm going to quick interject. So I did see a question come in. I want to encourage any more questions. We'll probably try and take them on the fly or maybe save some to the end. But Chris asked, do we recommend any particular vendors for some of that network segmentation? I think Jonathan mentioned NSX. I know at Virtual Systems we use NSX. Also, we use Palo Alto if we're talking about at the firewall level. Off the top of my head, I don't know, Jonathan, if you've got any others that you have seen out there.
So I think there's we still see a whole lot of Cisco in the provider space, and a lot of those core switches now have firewall feature set enabled as a matter of course, and that gives you IP and port level communication restrictions right in the core switches that you can leverage to further isolate your backup repositories.
Yeah. Appreciate the question.
So on the front end, obviously, we're Veeam. Veeam is just one tiny piece of the total puzzle, but we do have our methodologies and our data protection solutions that protect the data, of course. And then of course we have our Veeam One solution that has some canned monitoring to look for ransomware activity within. And then of course in breach situations or in ransomware situations, our goal is to make sure that you have all the tools necessary to recover as rapidly as possible and get those applications back into service. So we generally have talked about two challenges going forward that continue to affect the survivability of the data protection repositories. And one is, we talked a little bit about creating that functional air gap. And I think there's a second part of this, Derek. If you could just paint the screen, yeah. This is, getting that data isolated in some way at some functional level is really key to making sure that your backups can survive a ransomware attack. Because as I mentioned, ransomware is getting, and Dirk mentioned too, ransomware has been getting smarter, and it actively looks for the backup repositories. And in many cases, it is until the bad actors have identified the backup repositories, they wait on the actual deployment and execution of the encryption activities. So so creating that functional air gap is one method. And then the other one is when we talk about immutability, and that's actually creating or leveraging backup targets that have policies that prevent data from being altered, that in contrast to that policy, even by those who have root or high levels of administrative access. And this is what we're talking about when we talk about S3 object lock as a protocol for data protection. So when we talk about S3 object lock, this is built into the object protocol and implemented on the target system, such that if you set a policy that data cannot be deleted before 14 days or whatever your policy dictates, there is nothing that you can do at an administrative level to violate that policy, even if you gain full access to the system. And we're seeing greater interest in this, particularly among healthcare providers, both on and off premises. Mm-hmm. And I think this one paints one more step too, Dirk. Yeah, or maybe three more steps. We have built into our solution, one of the things we talked about, a couple things, right? Using S3 object lock to give you immutability, and also our advice has always been to have at least one copy of your data offsite. And using our cloud tier and scale out backup repositories, we make it very, very easy to get that data offsite, whether you're using an object repository or other repositories. This is the easy way to make sure that you have a comprehensive data protection policy that extends into the cloud and can take advantage of features like S3 Object Lock for immutability.
Yeah, I see a question from Robert about how you recover from a malware event. I think, so great question, number one. Number two, there are some different ways to do that. I know just as a service provider, one of the ways that Virtual Systems offers the solution is through a self-serve portal or through a managed option. So your method could either be just call our team and we're 24/7 available. And then we'll walk you through the recovery or actually deliver the recovery. Or you can do that through a self-serve portal, roll yourself back, potentially restore from immutable storage, and then keep going that way. But there's Veeam makes it really easy in the console. If you do have more detailed questions, love to show you, love to put you in contact with somebody on our team, or even maybe Veeam's team, and they can actually walk you through how that works. But very quick recovery with Veeam.
And on the topic of ransomware, we have a number of specific resources already assembled to help you defend against and recover from ransomware incidents.
Yeah. So let's talk about how the pandemic is shaping how we work. So moving from that topic of ransomware here, so this is crazy, right? We've been talking about remote work, I think, for a long time in healthcare. And just the ability for folks to kind of work in a hybrid, maybe I'm coming into the office today or maybe I'm not type of model. And we've been forced into that this year. So this research coming out of Gartner just a couple months ago, some really, I think, interesting stats. So globally, almost 9 out of 10 organizations have either required or encouraged employees to work remotely. And I looked at all the reporting. I suspect, even though Gartner didn't say this outright, that remaining 12%, there's a large bunch of that probably couldn't, and we think about like, direct healthcare providers who, in some cases there is no way to do that remotely. So a high percentage. So you look over here from the right in the box there to this stat at the left that says 74% of companies are planning to shift to more remote work. So, I mean, I think Gartner really kind of drawing that line and pretty concretely showing that we talk about this, we use this almost overused language of new normal now, but I think we're going to definitively really start to see the workplace taking a different shape. One of the questions they asked is this one at the bottom here. The question was something like, if your organization doesn't tell you you're going to work more remotely, are you bringing that up as an employee? Are you going to ask for more remote work? And 75% of staff were saying yes. They would request more, up to 35% or more remote work. So I think we're really going to continue to see that shift. That has a major impact, and this if if you're thinking about how this played out in your organization. Most organizations were not inherently built to, for this quick failover to remote work for everybody. It was some scrambling. We saw that in our client base. I know Veeam saw that. We're obviously, I mentioned we're a partner with VMware. I can't tell you the number of calls that got put off when we were having internal discussions with VMware because of, VMware's virtual desktop infrastructure solutions, and so many organizations, especially in healthcare, really kind of scrambling. So a lot of work to really do and think about, and a lot of policies to, bring back to the table for organizations and saying, why are we doing it this way? How are we protecting that data, especially when it comes, here at the top of the slide, to HIPAA and high-tech compliance and others, state guidelines. How are we continuing to do that? And I think, the message is we need sophisticated solutions that are flexible, that really allow us to pivot at a moment's notice. And I think that's bubbled up over the last few months more than maybe ever before. So we got to talk through these protocols for how we're housing data, how long we're keeping it. We got to be doing these employee trainings. I'll say Virtual Systems does offer some, a couple bucks a month per employee, and you can put them through video training and also experiential training. So they're getting emails in their box that bait them to click. You're seeing, as an IT administrator, you're seeing analytics on who's clicking and who's not, providing additional training. So that stuff, even thinking through device security. How are we protecting the data if it's sitting at an endpoint? Veeam's got some agent solutions for that. You know, you've got some protective things that you can put on the end device, or maybe just storing it in the cloud. But all of that dialogue comes back to the table, you know, when organizations have to make these huge shifts. So we did at Virtual Systems, we did just kind of some surveying. We had, you know, as the pandemic kind of rolled out, and we started having more and more of these conversations, we said we should collect some of these data, what customers are asking for and what methods they're using. And this is just kind of preliminary stuff, but I thought maybe it belonged here in this deck for healthcare. But you know, some of the questions: how are we protecting data when employees need to work anywhere? You know, and if you look over at the right, a lot of, you know, organizations they're doing different things, and none of them are wrong necessarily. They're just different. Some are extending the network, some are doing cloud delivery, productivity apps and SaaS. You know, we had so many conversations about customers who said, "Hey, we're going to just pull all of our data into Office 365." Microsoft's backing that up, and you know, it'll be protected and it's always available. And so a lot of education around that. We're going to touch on that a little bit later in this presentation too. But you know, these questions: if my IT architecture changes, are we staying compliant with HIPAA? Virtual Systems does a lot of work in the finance industry as well, so some of those same conversations around PCI and other things. And again, how are we educating employees? How are we securing endpoints? All of that stuff. So here's a stat that I thought was interesting. I think this one came out of Gartner too. On the right-hand side, 94% of malware is being delivered via email. And 80% of security incidents are the result of phishing. So to Jonathan's point earlier, it's getting better for the bad guys, more advanced. It's getting worse for us, you know, more difficult to avoid. So having the tools in place to, you know, assume that it's a breach. I think that's if you hang around CISOs a lot, information security officers, you'll hear that mantra, I think, quite often: just assume breach. That's going to happen. So what tools do we have to fix it once it happens? So Jonathan, talk to us a little bit about, you know, the SaaS stuff, you know, as we're talking about moving stuff into those productivity apps and how organizations are really kind of executing stewardship, and talk to us about availability and recovery here.
Actually, if you could just go back to stay on the last slide for just a moment. You know, software as a service is growing like crazy in healthcare. We see a lot of consumption of Office 365. It was first for Exchange, but now with the push to send everybody home, we're seeing a dramatic increase in the amount of use of Teams for collaboration across the organization. And of course, we've seen a lot of Workday, both for workforce management and for finances, and ServiceNow for service desk management. And all of these are changing where our data resides, and we need to spend a little extra time considering who is responsible for that information, both in its ongoing use and for the protection thereof. And we need to know where these different SaaS vendor policies begin and end so that we can make the appropriate decision as an organization about how we take stewardship of that information. So when we talk about Exchange in particular, I'm going to use this as an example. So we talk about designing systems in two different ways: designing for availability and designing for recovery. And they're distinct disciplines. They are often confused and not completely understood, and I think it merits some discussion about the two different things and what they're looking to solve for. Mm-hmm. And I'm using Exchange as an example here because it's an application that we've long run on premises in a highly available fashion, using Exchange's distributed availability group, which is a software-based cluster where we get at least 2 copies of all the data, usually in 2 different data centers. And we've been running this for a long time. And the goal of this is availability, continuous operation of that application. And we do this by replicating the data. And this allows us to handle hardware failure up to and including a site failure. It also gives us flexibility for maintenance because we can take one of the replicated nodes offline without affecting the availability of the service. The risk, though, if we're deploying systems only designed for availability, we have the risk of data loss and corruption or obfuscation, as is the case in ransomware, because any changes we make will be replicated to the other side. And usually there's not an undo button for this. And that's true in the Microsoft applications. If you deploy those applications in their highly available fashion, Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive for Business, and Teams, which of course is a compilation of OneDrive and SharePoint. If we design only for availability, we don't end up with an undo button. We don't end up with a mechanism to go back to a last known good configuration, which is the next thing that we have to do is design for recovery. And the role of designing for recovery has always been to make sure that we can restore a system and or its underlying data to a known good point. And we do this. This is the role that backup has always provided in the data center from the dawn of information technology. And this is how we address data loss or corruption or obfuscation, as is the case in ransomware. It also is the way we address policy errors. When we make administrative mistakes that results in data loss or data unusability, we need those backups to restore those systems to their last known good point in time. And this is why we have always backed up Exchange. Even when we deployed it in a highly available fashion, we've also backed it up every day. So now we look at the adoption of Office 365 from our most recent Veeam 2020 cloud survey, we see 86% of hospitals are planning to be on Office 365 by the end of 2021. And we see many of them are on it already, at least for Exchange. And as I mentioned, many more have deployed Teams for collaboration since they sent everybody home. So this really means we need to clearly understand what our responsibilities are when it comes to data protection for this data that we're giving to Microsoft to manage. Microsoft is running a distributed availability group for you. It says so in the documentation. So when we ran Exchange on premises, and again, we're just using Exchange as an example, these same arguments apply to SharePoint and OneDrive for Business as a replacement for file shares. When we ran Exchange on premises, we did deploy it in a highly available fashion for all the reasons that we've already discussed, but we also backed it up every day to make sure that we could recover from the unplanned, the unexpected, or accidents. Now, Microsoft is running that same platform for you in a highly available fashion, and they're not providing a daily backup. And they've become clearer about that statement in the last 6 months or so, amending their services agreement, which now actually says explicitly, we recommend that you regularly back up your content and data that you store on the services, because they are not providing a daily backup. And so if you animate this out, Dirk, that's why it is incumbent upon all of us who are actively leveraging Office 365 as a part of essential ongoing business processes. We must back it up every day, and Veeam has the best tool on the market right now to do so.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of, I think it's valuable that you say Veeam has made some amendments to their service agreement to clearly, or maybe more clearly, communicate to customers, because what we noticed was really as Veeam introduced this product to the market, whatever it was, a year or two ago, there was a lot of confusion. I think there still is a lot of confusion about what Microsoft's role is. And I think Microsoft even uses the role of the language of shared responsibility now, where they might not have done that right at the outset of the product, but really kind of encouraging both, the end customer or organization who's deploying and Microsoft itself to take some responsibility. And that's why, you see them doing things like, hey, it's a highly available environment, but also, of course, they're not going to keep everybody's data forever. So, so we've got a role too in how we manage our own data. So.
And we've had, just to close that out, we've had customers come to us looking for data protection for Office 365 after they've suffered data loss. So yeah, please don't find yourself in that category.
Yeah, so have we. And I mean, we are kind of, at Virtual Systems, we kind of sit in a very interesting and I think a cool spot, because we often see customers who are vetting several solutions against each other. We, just recently did this process with a pretty big bank that I would say, no matter where you live, the name of, and they, vetted some different products right next to each other, and Veeam came out as the leader on it. And it's so, I think it's just so interesting because Veeam's provided such a robust tool for that data management. But now that the information is out there that Microsoft's not doing it, there's plenty of other tools out there too. So, so let's move on to this topic of really cellular mobility or mobile data and how that's transforming healthcare. I think I mentioned at the beginning, I worked for Verizon in mobility for a number of years before I started working for a cloud service provider. So I got this interesting perspective, and my team collaborated with IT teams everywhere from, Fortune 15 companies down to SMB customers. So I had the experience of kind of watching mobility as an industry move from the fringes of IT conversations to maybe more core IT conversations. Networking is so important to every IT team and conversation, but you know, when we were on 3G networks and mobility, that wasn't really a viable solution for many things other than we'll give you a BlackBerry, which was obviously exciting for, you know, carriers like AT&T and Verizon. But now with the way, you know, we're seeing this transformation, or we did see it from 3G to 4G and now from 4G to 5G, and we'll look at that, what kind of effect that has had. We're really talking about super high speed, dense networks. And when we're thinking about things like software-defined networks for the organization, the way that that can play in with cellular mobility and the way we're moving data across networks, you know, I think brings many things back to the table for conversation. So, you know, today's networks quite a bit more reliable and better connectivity everywhere. So this is what we're seeing when we look from 4G to 5G. So if you remember, everybody was hyped, 4G launches, and all of a sudden, you know, we're at the grocery store and we can't figure out what the grocery list says, and so we can FaceTime our wife right there, or our husband, or whoever, and say, hey, this is what I'm standing in front of right now. What do you need me to get? And that was crazy. We couldn't do that before. And now all of a sudden we're talking about, and this may be, I think, the last time that we're going to see mobile networks actually advertised to consumers instead of businesses, because we're not going to feel this impact anymore, even though we will see 6G, 7G, 8G. It's not going to affect consumers as much, but it will affect businesses. You know, 10x decrease in latency. We're fitting 10 times the number of devices on the same network. We're putting more cellular nodes out there. So you walk around any downtown, and if you don't have experience with it, you might not notice it. I can't help but notice it now because I was with Verizon as they deployed some networks, but you see trash can sized things on light poles and on buildings, and all of these cellular nodes that become really ubiquitous and almost part of the new landscape, you know, fitting more devices onto a network and working on better in-building penetration and better throughput and better network efficiency. And that's just resulting in better connectivity and faster connectivity everywhere, which means, are we running backups over cellular networks someday? Probably. You know, I know, so Virtual Systems is already working on some stuff with some different carriers. We are actually a partner with Verizon and T-Mobile both, but I know of other organizations who are working on, you know, kind of some all-in-one backup devices that come with software and connectivity and protective networking layers, and it does all that stuff for you. So, you know, how we're moving stuff over those networks is just becoming more and more important. But it also begs some questions. Obviously, it allows employees to work anywhere better, but it begs some better questions about what are we doing with our data? Where are we putting it? If, you know, the more end devices we put out there, the more I think we have to be thinking about, are we putting data out on that end device, or are we making it, you know, are we just introducing portals to the data at the end device and the data actually sits in the data center, and how are we protecting that? And I think more and more that's the conversation that we're hearing about. And that begs some questions again about, and I think these are some of the best slides in the deck here. So about retention, compliance, how are organizations addressing some of that? Where are they putting the data? How are they keeping it away from end devices and protecting it inside, you know, a data center or somewhere central and consolidated? And then how are we making decisions about, you know, those things, retention, compliance, and all of that? So, Jonathan, can you walk us through some of that?
So it's very interesting. I found now, you know, studying almost exclusively data protection in healthcare now for 2 years, and talking to different hospitals in different cities running various EHRs who've made quite dramatically different decisions about how long to retain their backups. And the shortest that we've encountered is 28 days, and the longest that we've encountered is forever. And I find it very interesting that hospitals in the same states running the same EHR, bound by precisely the same regulatory framework, have arrived at opposite ends of a decision spectrum regarding backup retention. And I think it merits some real discussion from a cost perspective, which we'll get into in just a second. And then the other one, we don't really have time to go into it today, but when we talk about email retention and email history, there's a growing belief among some of the larger providers, and some of them are becoming more vocal about these policies. I've heard some representatives from New York Metro hospitals talk about this specifically. They're coming to the conclusion that email history is more likely to be an information liability than it is to be an information asset, and are beginning to explore policies that prevent retention of email over a certain time. The shortest I've encountered is 2 years, but there are plenty who've gone to 10 or 8 or 6, and who are busy ratcheting that down as the organization becomes more accustomed to that. But for the time, an important conversation that's relevant to your organization from a policy perspective. But let's continue our conversation just about backup retention in general. Now, and this was just a quick cost model to compare different backup retention periods from a total cost per month, assuming a certain number of VMs and a certain amount of PACS data. And as you can see, the healthcare systems that have made longer data protection decisions are incurring substantially greater total cost from both a capital and operating perspective, as you might expect, retaining that data for a longer period. And so the important thing to discuss, I think, is why are some organizations making different decisions along the spectrum and signing up for this different level of cost? And so I thought maybe we should spend a little time talking about the applicable regulations, because one of the things that I used to hear mentioned when I would ask questions like, why have you decided to keep your backups for years, or in some cases forever, I often hear HIPAA mentioned as an explanation. And as it turns out, HIPAA is silent on backup retention and patient health information retention in general. HIPAA says only that we should have backups, we must have backups, so we must be able to recover, and that we should test those recovery plans. When we talk about the retention of patient health information, those are actually the state regulations that govern that. That's where we see the language that tells us how long we need to keep a record. And so if we look at California, just as an example, it says patient records shall be preserved for a minimum of 7 years following discharge, except unemancipated minors, in which case we have to keep it 1 year past their 18th birthday, in any case not less than 7 years. And it's important to note, and there's the language varies state to state, as you might expect, different time periods, but it's largely similar in that the language is intended to apply to the records of the visits themselves. There is no mention of applicability to backups. And so remember what backup is for. The role that backup plays in the data center is to ensure that we can restore an application or its underlying data to a last known good state. So if that is our purpose, there's very little value. The older a backup gets, the less valuable it is. And then the other question we have to ask is, are we actively purging PHI from our ongoing systems to which the regulatory language applies? And I have yet to find a single health institution that actively purges PHI, even when permitted to do so by the applicable regulations. So if that's the case, that means that the backups from last night are going to have all the same records as the backups from a year ago, which I and many other health systems are arguing basically eliminates the value of those old backups. And that is the justification that they have used to draw the line at 30 days or even 60 days. It's still very reasonable. And view those the backups as only a method to recover that system and not as a long-term retention strategy. So that often begs the question then, well, what do we do about things we do want to keep longer than those short periods for restoration purposes? If we go to the next slide, Dirk, that's where we start talking about how we look at backup and how we define backup. I believe backup should be used for the shortest period possible to assure that we can recover from the unexpected, the unplanned, as all the scenarios that we've already discussed. When we do have a need to put a system or data on ice for a longer period, as we might with the sunsetting of an application, we want to fully decommission it. We think the data is elsewhere, but we want to put it on ice for 12 months or 18 months. That can still be delivered by the data protection infrastructure, but it should be delivered by separate policies. I think a lot of organizations have tried to use one single data protection policy to address a whole range of potential needs that may extend long into the future. That it stresses backup, and also it has another unfortunate side effect of making data protection an inflexible solution in the environment because it's so difficult to switch from one to the other, even when superior systems emerge in the marketplace. And then the last case, the organizations that I've seen deal with legacy applications most effectively, legacy applications pose all kinds of problems in that hospitals are managing often hundreds of applications, some of whom are only used by a few people, some of whom are from vendors that are out of business or no longer have support. Many times we see this where Windows 2000 and Windows 2003 are kicking around in the data center to support some old applications. There are a number of vendors listed here that can help you replicate the data structures and interfaces for those old applications. Pull the data permanently out into a more modern platform, a modern database with a modern scalable front end that allow you to permanently sunset those old applications. And the ones that I've observed do this have been able to remove tons of legacy applications from their data center and modernize the whole platform and reduce the attack surface in the process. So we at Veeam, we can talk to, when we talk about the total cost of data protection, we end up invariably discussing hardware because capital is among the largest cost in the data center. And we can put protected data anywhere. We can use just about anything as a backup repository, but there are implications of those choices. And if your backup policy, and here's the linking that is relevant to this conversation. We read the regulations, we use that to inform our policies, and then very often our policies, depending on what they are, may well dictate technology choices, which has real consequences depending on what we desire from those solutions. So if we go to the next slide and we talk about what these different policies mean, when we look at very short retention, less than a quarter, and I think 30-60 days is a really good target for all of this. We at Veeam have observed that the lowest total cost on-premises backup repository is a server with lots of disk in it. We have a number of these from various manufacturers. And not only does this give us extremely low total cost backup repository, also gives us a great deal of performance because we have a lot of spindles inside that give us very good random IO performance, which is exactly what we need for rapid recovery, whether we're doing something like instant recovery with Veeam, where we can actually mount the backup and boot the machine and get the application back into service very, very quickly and then do the restore to its proper home in the background. Or whether we're talking about a holistic recovery of many systems. We really want good performance in our backup repository. But as we start to look at, if we interpret policy and conclude that we need to keep our backups for very long periods of time, particularly, definitely over 90 days, but especially when we start talking about multiple years, we're invariably going to conclude that dedupe appliances are the optimal repository for cost reasons. But the consequence of that decision is performance. They're optimized to store a lot of data, especially redundant data, over a long period of time, but they offer very poor random read performance, which is exactly what we need to do things like rapid recovery or instant recovery as using our methodology, or when we do holistic resource of many systems. So I firmly believe there's a huge opportunity for more providers, any provider who's keeping their backups for longer than 90 days, especially longer than a year, to revisit reread the regulations and revisit all of the policies, because it may well be that an overly risk-averse data protection retention policy is driving technology decisions that deliver the exact opposite of what we actually require from our data protection infrastructure.
I agree, and I want to reiterate that and say if you don't get anything else out of this webinar, and I think there's a lot of just gold in it from Jonathan, but bring some of these policies back to the table with your team and reevaluate and talk about them again. It's been interesting to see the cost of storage in the cloud come down over the last few years. It was not very long ago that people were paying a couple $100 a tear for what we would call production storage in the data center, and now we're a fraction of that. And add in the potential for object storage at or in some cases $10 a tear or something. Depends on what you're doing. But I mean, the cost has come down, and I think what we've seen because of that is a lot of organizations are saying, hey, the easy button is store everything because the cost is lower. But what Jonathan is saying is there is also an additional cost to that strategy, and that can be your RTOs, your ability to rapidly recover. And that also is, I think a big part of the discussion. So just bringing some of these policies back to the table and having the conversations again about RTO, RPO, about, how long we're going to keep data, I think is so valuable. And I'll put out there, I know Veeam will help you with that conversation. Virtual Systems will help you with that conversation if you want to bring us to the table. But certainly, at least bring some of this stuff back to the table with your team.
And just to cap this off, our most recent Veeam 2020 cloud survey, 82% of hospitals desire downtime less than 2 hours, which means, and of course, obviously we want downtime to be 0 if possible. But certainly when we consider the performance capabilities of our data protection infrastructure, we want to be able to get applications back into service as rapidly as possible. And that means we need higher performing data protection infrastructure.
So that's really bringing everything to a close here for us. There's a couple of takeaways that we'd love for you to have coming out of this. I hope you found it valuable. I hope you found some of this information helpful to at least maybe, help your team have some more conversations. But, continue to think about education for your employees. Continue to think about best practices for data protection. Review your policies again. Think about how you can improve the application recovery speeds and keep us in the loop. There's some resources here that Veeam's got. We can certainly, you'll get this deck, so everybody who's registered will have this. You can QR code this stuff or just click the link. But, our contact information here, so direct numbers to either myself or Jonathan, and there's our emails. We'd love to kind of help you continue to have the dialogue if you feel like you want us at the table. So again, hope you found this valuable. I didn't see any more questions in the Q&A here.
There was a question from one of the participants asking if you could speak to your data encryption practices, and that was directed specifically for you, Dirk.
Yeah, great question. So Veeam does provide encryption in the software. We also do encryption at the hardware level. It's kind of an opt-in for customers if you've got data at rest. But some of that is kind of custom one-off stuff. So we'd love to have the conversation with you about, what the encryption needs are. But Veeam does a good job of doing some of that encryption work for us. And if you need additional encryption, we use storage technologies that allow customers just to opt into that. So real easy to do. So I did see another one about HIPAA compliance. So the question is, so Virtual Systems does a lot at the data center level and at the service provider level with compliance for customers. I will say, so this question is specifically, can you provide a BAA? And I get that question a lot, and we do. We've got a BAA, so a business associates agreement, so that we can kind of operate as an extension of your organization, which allows us to, work on your data as well and keep you in compliance. A lot of customers just kind of think that's a checkbox that they have to check, and then we give them an executive summary on the HIPAA compliance in the data center, and they think they're good. But the way you handle your data also matters. So just because we have a stamp on the data center, just because Veeam allows for our ability to, show that a solution is HIPAA compliant, doesn't mean the way that you're using it all the time is, or the way you're moving around the network is. So that is part of a bigger conversation. And again, I think worth having the conversation with your team. We do that a lot. We work with outside auditing firms who come in, and a lot of times at no cost. We'll just provide some guidance to that conversation. So if that's something you're thinking about with your data, then we'd love to keep talking with you about it. But the short answer is we do the BAAs, we do the HIPAA compliance at the solution level. So, and Veeam allows for that too. So that's all there. So any other questions, Jonathan, that you saw? I think that's all I got. Good. Well, thank you again. Again, you'll get a slide deck that comes out to you, including the recording here. Thanks for coming. Hope you have a great day. Thanks again, Jonathan.
Let's do it again sometime.
You bet.